Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have a little bit ungrateful task, because after the discussion of Professor Mearsheimer and Balázs Orbán, basically everyone left the ballroom. But I'm very happy that some of you are back, and I feel myself much more at the university in this seminar class type of presentation. But anyway, we will do our best. I'm the lucky one who will guide you through this panel, where we will put the most pressing structural issues of the European Union under a magnifying glass. Inter alia, these issues are related, and we are going to discuss the cooperation of member states and the European Union, the decision-making process within the community, questions of legislation and enforcement of EU law, as well as means to improve operational efficiency, and finally the chances of the European Union to play a more serious role in the multipolar world order, if there are such chances. Dear colleagues, as we all know, the EU is a unique sui generis type of alliance, complicated, overlapping powers to legislate between the European Union and the member states, and the strong supranational framework can challenge the sovereignty many times and overshadow the national priorities. Sovereignty is a value in itself, as it originates from the self-respecting autonomous society of any given nation. But on the other hand side, it also has practical values, as sovereignty on the practical side basically means self-awareness, independence, and the ability of self-governance. My first question would be, according to this phenomenon, the sovereignty and the challenges of the sovereignty by the European Union in its current form. And let's start with Radomir, if I may. How do you see, Radomir, how does the EU's complicated organizational structure result in contentious intra-European politics and induce inefficiencies within the single market?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. I think these are particularly important questions for Hungary, given the unique role it's carved for itself. I just want to start by having paid tribute to the Hungarian strategy within its EU context. I just want to start by being slightly irritating and picking at one of the accepted paradigms, I think, of Hungarian statecraft as I understand it, which is that although there is a concern with the direction of EU political integration and the pressure that Hungarian sovereignty is put under, there is an acceptance that the single market, as a kind of a separate concept, is a good thing. To some extent it is, but I'm increasingly alarmed at the direction of travel. And this is how I'd approach your question about the complications of EU lawmaking and that particular structure. The capacity of Europe as an entity and European nations to project power in the world and to stand up for the Western values that I know we all share is, first of all, going to be a result of internal dynamism, of internal strength, of domestic strength. The way that the single market and national economies is now going is to a very destructive place. Net zero related edicts, whether it's at the national or EU level, are beginning to de-industrialize Europe, and we are losing ground rapidly to our primary peer competitor, that is China. So the direction of travel in the single market is alarming. I want to make another more general point. The nature of the single market that I don't see the EU as being able to change is, to me, profoundly anti-innovation. And that means it is destroying prosperity. And this is the fundamental challenge above all for the European Union. Why? It's important that we remember prosperity in human history is very rare, partly because innovation is very rare. The way EU laws are made generally, and EU regulations generally uphold the position of incumbents. That means big corporates that don't have any interest in creative destruction So EU regulations are pulling up the ladder from small, competitive, creative destroyers in our economy. And this is killing growth in Europe, and that will destroy Europe's, in the long run, capacity to project power. Very briefly, before I hand over to our friends on the panel, one reason is that the European Union is designed to keep new regulations and new laws ultimately decided by a closed group. The European Parliament, in effect, cannot propose new legislation and new regulations. They come from the Commission to co-repair to the Council, and the Parliament plays a very limited role. That means the EU, according to its functionalist philosophy, is set up so that regulations are determined by large corporates. So to get back and finally, in my long-winded way, forgive me, answer your question, I think the single market from the outset has been doomed to slow down European growth precisely because of the complicated, opaque, self-referencing mechanism of EU law. And that only has one gear, and that's my fundamental concern.
Thank you very much, Radomir. Anna, how do you see this from the inside?
So good morning to you all. Thank you for the invitation. I need to agree with you. It's very complex. So I want to first highlight the fact that the European Union is a great project, a great idea, but it's very difficult to put in practice because there are so many paradoxes inside that undermines this project. It's like balancing so many things in so many places. Imagine this. If I was also a member of the Portuguese government, I was also a member of the Portuguese Parliament, and I came from the private sector. I'm a lawyer, but it's so difficult when you need to decide for one culture, one national perception with so many dreams, and then you merge, you add 27 national perceptions, national cultures. It's not only about legislation, law, it's about culture. For example, in my country, we have so many different cultures, so many different ideas, and they are all good. I love them all. I respect them all. So, saying that, Europe is based on consensus, and nations and the countries, the politics on countries are based in majority. So if it is difficult to get a majority or to get to achieve this, how is this possible in European Union with 27? It's difficult, it's very challenging, and this is the challenge. And now in Europe we are facing this. You said, we have too many studies, bureaucracy is being pointed as a big problem in Europe. And I could say so many else, I could point it so many else, like Professor Mersheimer already pointed some of them, more related with security and defense, of course, but we have so many problems before that. And also you pointed another very good, I was a member elected by my citizens, and sometimes I don't feel that I have the power to change anything, but it's me as a politician who will do the campaign, who need to face the citizen. So this is very difficult, and this is, and I will hand this first question saying that the decision-making process, the time we need to make decisions, It's killing the action of Europe. So this is very difficult when you are living in an era where time is the biggest asset. Time. And we need to change something, and we need and this change needs responsibility, needs reality, and we need to say this and to assume this with some serenity, without anyone pointing us as being extremists or something like that.
Thank you very much, Anna, for sharing your experiences with us. If there is a country which has a vast experience with the challenges of the European Union, apart from Hungary, of course, that is Poland. So, Jerzy, I would like to ask your take on that.
Thank you so much. I'm still excited and energized after the conversation we had in the morning. Thank you so much, Gladden. Thank you so much, ORF, for arranging that happen and us to participate in that. And when we speak of realist approach, the European Union was conceived as a realist project with a heavy input from the superpower of the United States in 40s, 50s. And what was the DNA of the project? It was consensual, it was flexible, and it was multi-speed approach. We lost all those three foundations of the community. Instead, we are in the middle of exercising and implementing greater cohesion, more centralization, and unified artificial European nation project. So instead of sovereign nations community, we are moving into an ideologically created liberal hegemon over European continent without having a single political community, a demos, that could somehow give birth to a democracy on a European level. So without a democracy, and that's something that is a diagnosis of everybody now, from the left to the right, that in European Union we do experience lack of democratic oversee and democratic accountability of the powers. We do not have democratic power, and instead of that we have a liberal creeping authoritarian pressure of the European agendas. And that's what Poland experienced in the previous years, and that is what Hungary experiences just now, with this pressure built upon a political agenda of Brussels. And when we speak of greater cohesion approach, greater cohesion approach was born in 80s, and then with Maastricht Treaty it was mainstreamed, and then with a Lisbon Treaty it was rooted in the fundamental treaties of European Union. But still, theoretically, according to the treaties, the national identities and even constitutional identities, different constitutional identities, are part of our European heritage and part of the constitutional system of Europe. So what is happening now since 2021-2022, and what has been already officially accepted under the treaties as the treaty reform in November 2023 by the European Parliament voting, is a totally new constitutional system of European Union with 267 amendments to the treaties that are just now put on the table by the Constitutional Committee of European Parliament, headed by Guy Verhofstadt, accepted in the resolution of European Parliament, and still yet not put for voting and for ratification of the member states. Why? Because initially it was Hungarian presidency, then it was, initially it was European Parliament elections, then Hungarian presidency, and then Polish presidency of Donald Tusk. But Donald Tusk, of course, is a great supporter of the reform. But at the same time, we had presidential elections. So it was impossible for the Polish government to push for centralization and push for the final taking back of sovereignty of the nation states before presidential elections. And now what we will see in the next months probably will be the next step of this constitutional reform of European Union. And of course, we need to reply to that. We need to present a counter-proposal. We need to provide a proposal that will make the European internal debate, constitutional debate, on what is Europe more balanced. And good to speak together with a representative of Matthias Corvinus' Collegium, because just this year we presented a report, The Great Reset of European Union, together with Matthias Corvinus' Collegium, that was for the first time taking in a single document all the sovereign proposals for the reform of Europe. And of course, Anne Applebaum in New York Times reviewed our proposal as Hungarians and Ordo Iuris from Poland advising Donald Trump how to dismantle European Union. And the same was then repeated by Radosław Sikorski. He happens to be her husband, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, in his exposé to the Polish Parliament. But of course, it was not our aim. Our aim was to provide a scenario that will make European Union great again, that will make European Union survive. Because the alternative scenario also in the report is, yes, is dismantling of European Union and providing an alternative treaty basis for the cooperation. Because if we are not successful in stopping the greater cohesion scenario, in stopping the centralization scenario that is making Europe not competitive on the global market, then the European Union will collapse by itself without any assistance of any of the states. And then we will need the second scenario. So what we are experiencing now from the point of view of national states is the major threshold when we will choose between centralized Europe or flexible, based on consent cooperation.
Thank you very much, Jerzy. Yes, please.
I just had a comment.
Sure.
You said one beautiful thing, make Europe great again. But I think it's more like make Europe, this dream, possible and a reality. This is more about taking this dream from the papers to reality and change people's life, because politics is about that. And I truly believe that Europe project and Europe dream was in all these treaties, in all these laws, it's to change people's life. It's about lives and values, but we need to be real. This project needs to be real.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. Philip, you live in Brussels, so this is the great cave of the lion or the cave of the great lion. You can decide which one you choose. How does it seem on the ground?
Thank you very much. It looks good when you're sitting in bars or restaurants. Outside, it's perhaps less pleasant, but always very interesting. I'd perhaps preface what I'd like to offer as some observations to your question by an axiom and then come back to it at the end. Every system devised by humans heads into the direction of failure, necessarily. It can have a prolonged life through reform when necessary. Eventually, the creativity or the political will or the other necessary ingredients to perform reform will fail and the system will go down. That's why history is a graveyard of states. Now, to the European Union, to argue with some long-term trends. I think that again is true for every organization. There is the Weberian law of permanent growth. And that goes also hand in hand with centralization. So once we set up something such as the Community for Coal and Steel, it was actually back at that time, and you find it in the original documents, set up to be a system that is dysfunctional unless it is expanded to further sectors. And this is what happened throughout the decades, but since we started from something very small and some very specific, plus with a limited number of 6 states, it was much more functional. And what's today the Commission back then was essentially a general secretariat that worked, as the name suggests, mostly as a secretariat. And there was no one sitting there explaining, I want this to be a geopolitical commission or something of the sort. Now, throughout the decades, this obviously has evolved into being a much more complicated, much wider institution. and one that has become, in many regards, also much more unwieldy because it is regulated to the point of the administrators within the European institutions being physically unable to absorb all the regulation that comes out of the European bodies. It's just humanly not possible. So that is one typical growth element of any administration, and that is certainly true for the EU. So we are on the road to either failure or reform. We need reform, otherwise the system as such is going to go bankrupt and away, and they would have to revise something similar or new, but in a much more limited and functional way. Second observation, that is something which influences how the EU evolves, but comes from the states. I'd say that sometimes in the 1970s, there has been a shift from a participatory democratic system to a managerial welfare state system. Now, those two are always in, both components are in Western or generally in European modern states, so they are not exclusive. However, if you go more and more into the managerial direction to assure welfare, instead of maintaining the uncomfortable participatory nature of the polis and the more democratic decision-making, then you have a sort of natural rapprochement between how managerial states function and how the EU as a regulatory administrative body functions. And I think we are at a point or within a time window where, due to pressures from within our societies and from outside actors, we cannot hold this model much longer. So have to rethink not just how we organize ourselves in the EU, but this is going to affect how the states themselves function. That might be a good thing, because the most important body still for the fundamental long-term decisions of the European Union is the Council, so the collective of the national governments. And we can perhaps take this momentum to do something which is very necessary, and that is reform, particularly of the European Commission. In my opinion, it needs to be, at least in competencies, cut down again to being more of a general secretariat, and not a body that tries to impose on national governments that are outside of the let's say the mainstream position that is held by the high-ups of the European Commission. Or actually, no, the higher middle management, because those are the ones that do not change with the Commission Collegium, to get back to something which is more responsive to the Council and less prone to regulatory management through the Commission. And I think this is something which is important to understand, that most of the impositions, let's say, that come from Brussels do come from regulations from the Commission and not so much from legislation proper that goes through the Council and through the Parliament. So that would be a good place to start.
Thank you very much, Philip. And last but not least, Bogi, as a former Deputy State Secretary for EU Affairs and the Ministerial Commissioner, you are very much experienced in the legislation and enforcement procedures of the EU. So I would be grateful if you address the question whether you believe that the law and policy-making structure and processes of the Union of today help Europe to form a pole in the multipolar world order. What's your take on that?
Thank you very much, Akos. I don't think it's maybe my positions in the government that are very important for these questions, but maybe my experience in Brussels, as I spent 16 years in the Brussels bubble, and referring to the question, actually the last sentence of the question, of your question, I really don't think that now the European Union, as it stands now, we heard all the reasons behind, is equipped to act as a true pole to this emerging multipolar world. And I don't think it's because of the consensus rule, because I think we will maybe talk about it later, because I think it's really essential to safeguard the national sovereignty and the political legitimacy of the European Union. But I think it's also because of this bureaucratic rule, is bureaucratic logic that basically governs the European Union inside. And also, let's not forget what we've been experiencing in the past decade. The European Union suffered from one crisis to another. And what have we seen? Basically, that the European Union has given I think, wrong answers to this crisis. But what happened is that they got a possibility, basically, to have more and more competencies with every crisis. And this is what we called also as a centralization, and we also talked about it in the panel before. Also, another, I think, let's put it like this, a poisoning issue is the ideologically driven policies that the European Union is now making, like the Green Deal or the sanction-led policies. Let's have just one number and one fact why the EU is actually decreasing significantly. The EU role in the global world is significantly decreasing. In 2004, 20% of the EU's GDP share was the EU, and now it is 14. So we have to, and that's why also one of our main priority of the Hungarian presidency was restoring the competitiveness. We talked about it at Orbán Balázs talked about it at the panel before, so I'm not going to go to lengths, but exactly what happened, it was a consensus-based priority. Everyone agreed, Lati, Draga reports, the whole continent was here. We had the Budapest Declaration, and where do we stand now? We have growing energy prices, reindustrialization, small and medium sizes enterprises suffering from burdens, over-regulation. So these are the things I think we really have to see and we really have to address and think about solutions. We talked about realism, pragmatism, maybe we will talk about it later, but I really don't think that centralization is a solution. The more the European Union is becoming centralized, I think the more these own foundations, the foundations of its legitimacy, it will be undermined. So, and lastly, because we are talking long, lastly on the law and policy making situation, well, let's talk about the consensus. You know, we hear many times that the EU is weak because of the consensus rule, because of the unanimity. Well, I really don't think so. I fundamentally disagree. This consensus principle is not a flaw. This is actually the remaining few structural guarantees in the European Union for member states, for sovereign member states to still have a say, basically in decision making that directly affects their the core of their national interest. And actually, if we weaken this, it's not going to be strength, it's going to be backlash and alienation. And lastly, you know, when we hear about that we don't speak one voice and that's a problem, I don't think so. That's a problem because this is what the European Union, it is actually. Unity in diversity is the motto of the European Union. And what is happening now? Basically, it's a pressure to uniformity. So I really think that we shouldn't erase this diversity, because every member state has a different cultural, historical identity in the European Union, in this continent. So we should not erase this. The path forward is that we agree on the issues which are very needed to agree when we have common grounds. And when we don't have common grounds, then we let it to the member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bogi. I believe that all the panelists agreed that what was once a fast and flexible alliance, so to say, is now gone, is now lost. So we arrived to a slow and bureaucratic and managerial situation where a univocal voice or a uniform voice is required, which is clearly not a good situation for the member states. So in the next round of question, I would like you to help me find a way out of this situation, to work on a way out, because change is clearly desperately needed. And the question is, do you believe that a more federalist, a more centralized, but we already touched upon the question, a more federalist, more centralized approach is required, or should we instead prefer a more sovereignist approach? Could it help to improve internally the European Union and also in the external relations? Radomir, please.
Thank you. I'd actually first just like to pick up on a couple of things. First that Jerzy and then Philip said. Jerzy, I agree with almost everything you just said, apart from one very specific point. And it's that the European Union, as it's become has ceased to be consensual. On the contrary, I think it's highly consensual. I think it's more consensual than ever in a smaller and smaller group, and that's how consensus is maintained. So to your points, Philip, I also would, despite being a out and out Brexiteer, I also would like to see a reformed European Union. However, I think how any institution will be is often best judged by how it has been. And what concerns me is the reforms that have taken place over the last decade or a generation or so. So what have we seen? We've seen, you mentioned the council. We've seen in the council, the national veto has almost gone. It's been replaced by QMV, qualified majority voting. Again, a profoundly anti-national sovereignty move. And what does QMV now mean in practice? Because of the double majority system, things can be passed with a vote representing 55% of the European population and 65% of member states. What this means, I'm afraid, in practice, is that there is a continual inbuilt German-dominated Eurozone majority. That's just an uncomfortable fact we now need to face about the European Union. So I want to answer your question about what does this mentality mean? Well, your final point about Europe in the world and European action externally. I think there are some grave things at stake now, and we need to be, to quote Professor Mearsheimer a few moments ago, somewhat more realist in our approach. Why are we even more tempted than usual to check the news on our phones today? Because a European-led diplomatic project almost gave Iran a nuclear weapon. And once again, an American-led alliance is going to have to clear up the mess. So, let's think about if this actor on the world stage is to grow, let's think about, away from that particular instance, how policy is made, how policy is liable to be made. We've all talked around this a little bit, but policy comes from the Commission, it goes through the Committee of Permanent Representatives and to the Council. Most policy, I understand, 70–90% of legislative proposals are decided before they even reach the Council by consensus within that small group at the Committee of Permanent Representatives. Again, to return to your question about Europe as an actor in the world, potentially as a pole in the world, the European defence harmonisation project is now, in my view, a beginning peer competitor to NATO. And I think, again, the Hungarian government has been absolutely right in making clear its commitment to NATO and to the American-led alliance. And if that emergence of a peer competitor to NATO in a whatever you choose to call it, defence harmonisation, PESCO, as Jean-Claude Juncker called it just a few years ago, common EU army, let's consider how policy is made. Let's think back to that structure of decision-making that is increasingly closed. We have a grave threat, potential theoretical threat emerging to national sovereignty if ultimately what military force is it has to require at times a monopoly on violence with EU battle groups and so on. I don't want to get carried away here because it's at this stage of theoretical concern, but there is a very grave challenge to the nation state as an entity if the EU defence harmonisation project continues. Do I think it's a serious threat? No, not directly, because to quote Mrs. Thatcher when she left power and became a high-octane Eurosceptic, of course it will fail. The question is how long it takes and the damage done. So I don't think ultimately European Union defence harmonisation could work. But it will risk doing one thing, and that's, again, as Professor Mearsheimer said, Donald Trump thinks sceptical thoughts about NATO. And if the European Union even presents itself as a peer competitor to NATO that could do NATO's job in the defence of the European continent, which it cannot, then we could be moving to a more and more NATO-sceptic American regime, which could have very concerning consequences. So To conclude, I believe profoundly in the defense of the European continent from various threats from points east. And I think we need to be realistic about who underwrites our security, and that is the Atlantic Alliance, particularly the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radomir. Anna, how do you see this as a former member of parliament? The sovereignty versus federalist approach?
I don't have a strong answer because this is very difficult. Consensus has a price to pay. Every decision in politics has a price. So if you are taking in a European level, you need to pay a price in your national level, and vice versa. So what I'm saying is that, okay, of course we need to, this is, European Union is a joint venture of 27 countries that want to, they start with this economical approach, this view of things, of commerce, and then we want to step up to another level of this reunion. And this is the question, because you mentioned, I think it was you mentioned the Treaty of Lisbon. We tried to go further and to get to a political level, but in practice, we are facing so many difficulties to put this in practice. So this is what I want to highlight here, is the difficult to put this project and to put this idea in reality. The second is that I'm truly a defender of this national perspective. Of course, I'm not an extremist, but we need to get this strategic autonomy, because we recognize ourselves there. We have this level of government. And COVID bring this to reality, because when we face a crisis and an emergency, because politics, it's good when you have money to share with the citizens and to give to them. But when crises appear is when you see and test your projects and your ideas. And we have first the COVID, and we saw it, how Europe could, in the first moment, we are not able to deal very well with it, because we saw how our economical diplomacy goes so badly, because we export our dependence. And so when we face crisis, we see, oh, we were so dependent on China goods. And this was very difficult, because I was in the parliament by the time, and we need to make, in Portuguese parliament, and we need to take so many decisions, and we get to a point that, okay, who will help us now? And we saw the difficulties by the time. So I'm not saying that I'm against the project, okay? I think that we need to be more responsible, we need to be more autonomous, and then the war brings us this reality. And it's bring us another reality that we will face in a few months, that is this. For example, I'm from Portugal. So for my government, it's very difficult to explain to people, to their citizens, the investment we need to do in defend ourselves. For example, comparing with my colleagues and my friends from Poland and from Estonia and other countries, it's very difficult to, the experiences are so different. So this is a challenge for us to try to balance these interests, to try to balance this and to try to find some consensus. And this is very difficult. And that's why I think that changing the model to trying to bring the European Union to a more flexible model, it's very difficult. You are facing so many challenges now. How can you? The first difficulty is bureaucracy, is regulation. How can you deal with, how can you explain this regulation, for example, to the European agricultures? When Europe is having a position to their citizens, applying so many rules, demanding so many things, and at the same time you are buying so many products that are not accomplish these rules. So this creates unfairness feelings, and this is the beginning of the end of the relationship between the citizens and the politicians.
Well, thank you, Anna. Very interesting point. Bureaucracy is really a tough thing. Can it be broken? What do you think, Jerzy? You at Ordo Juris do extensive research on the topic. I would be interested very much in your opinion, briefly, but yeah, please, we need to cut it short because we are running out of time. Thank you.
The short answer to your previous questions, of course, sovereignty. And of course, we need flexibility. We need consensual-based policy making, and we need a system of multi-speed integration and an opt-out system from this integration for the nation states members of the European Union. And all of those elements show to a new model of intergovernmental cooperation that is rising now in the 21st century. And it's seldom for a Polish to say that I agree with a Russian friend, but yesterday we heard Victoria Panova saying on BRICS, for BRICS to be a new model of international cooperation that is based on flexible, consensual, and respect for diversities. And probably if European Union is to ignite anew this creativity, internal market of ideas, internal competitiveness that will make the community competitive on a global market again, we need to reignite those elements that are there in the structure and in the identity and in the history of Europe. This diversity of political ideas, diversity of economical models, without a common central planning mechanism of Brussels. And this will lead to a new global multipolar community and cooperation with Europe as a single unit on many levels, but without unified political structure that will, of course, destroy sovereignty and will make it not competitive community anymore. More than 100 years ago, Lasse Oppenheim, one of the creators of the doctrine of the science of the modern international public law, observed that when we are moving from the hegemon international politics into multipolar politics, the international public law again plays a role of this gentle pacifier of nations. And if we are now coming into this sphere, we need to prepare the community for it to be internally respectful for the sovereignties and then able to act in a unified way on a global market.
Thank you very much, Jerzy. How do you see it, Philip, from Brussels? Is it a dream to create a more flexible, more respectful European Union, or we can make it a reality? Or how can we make it a reality? To make it even more difficult for you.
Yeah. I think that a couple of very good points have already been made on this. My take is from the foreign policy point of view, if it could be a useful poll there. Good, thank you. So the European Union could be a very useful thing for itself and for the European state. in navigating international regimes of various sorts. The Commission alone is something north of 30,000 people, which, by the way, is about how many people the city of Munich employs. So it's not this super tanker either. But those are people who are, if only that, very capable at navigating administration and behaving as administrators and regulators. So send them to all the various international arrangements that we have and be the representatives and the negotiators in that regard, because that is something that they are very well trained, or would be very well trained to do. The European Union is not so much in the business of politics as it is in the business of regulation. So when it comes to geopolitics, we are misplacing our expectations when we say the EU should do something about this. So in that regard, it definitely, in my opinion, should be the sovereign states. If we have an agreement of all 27, that can go through the council or not, but the effect is going to be the same. It's an agreement of the 27. So that's the more interesting point in that. So I think it can be a very useful tool under one condition, and I'll stop on this. And that is a decision that we in Europe, not just the EU people, but when Europe need to make, what do we want the EU to be on the international stage? And I think, to oversimplify the issue, during the unipolar moment, the multilateral institutions, United Nations, a number of others, have been westernized to a degree which is against what they were supposed to be. I mean, the United Nations were co-created by the Soviet Union. It was a balancing forum. And now the idea of the, let's say, especially Democrat establishment in the United States and large parts of the establishment in Europe is that we should maintain multilateral institutions on this westernizing course, which means that they are not performing the task anymore. So either we keep on that road with the EU of westernizing multilateral formats until they fail, or we move to something which is more sensible also for the European Union itself and encourage multilateralism to adapt to multipolarity, which is already there anyways. So those would be two courses of action, one not so good, one much better. So if you can go for that, it would be a very useful tool, and the EU could be very useful for the European states in that.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. And Bogi, would you share your views on this issue, please? Thank you.
Yes, I'm always the last, so I always have to hurry, but I will. So first, I think that we should, the European Union should abandon this illusion of a single political identity, and we should actually, or not we, because we do that, but the European Union as a whole and the majority should also embrace what the EU is, the community of sovereign states. Also, we often hear more Europe is needed. I really don't think so that more Europe is needed. What happened in the past 10, 15 years? Commission is increasingly getting political, fighting battles with the European Parliament, following their own agenda. The Commission is now, I don't think it's actually the guardian of the treaties, as it should be, as it is written in the treaty. What is happening now, the Commission is basically threatening member states with freezing funds or with kind of politicized legal instruments like the rule of law. Also, I think we talked about it all, about pragmatism and realism. We need a pragmatic Europe, a Europe based on democracies, and we shouldn't stigmatize and label each other based on abstract ideological ideas, because we have just a different system, constitutional structures, political diversity, and also identity. So this is something that we should go back to the roots. And then one thing that Jerzy mentioned about the great reset, we also should listen to the citizens, because I don't think the European Union is listening now. And we had an experiment in 2021, 2022. We had the conference on the future of the European Union, when Hungary was one of the most active, actually the most active country. That was a kind of poll system. We organized, not we, but in Hungary in general, more than 800 conferences were organized. And our messages, our opinions, they didn't get to the final document. Why? Because only the pro-federalist ideas were welcomed. And actually, we had a brochure about that, the Hungarian proposals on the future of the European Union, when we say about already the things 4 years ago, that now it's on the table. So how to avoid the competence creep, that we have a clear catalogue of competences, that we strengthen the role of the national parliaments, we strengthen the role of the European Council, the majority voting excluded from the key national sovereignty areas like CFSP or like gender issues or like migration. So we already talked about this, and it's nothing new. It's just going back to the roots, but we didn't manage to get it through because obviously that was not the aim. The aim was to legitimize this federalist idea of Guy Verhofstadt that Jerzy talked about. And the end of this Conference of Europe is actually what Jerzy talked about, this AFCO or European Parliament document for the changing of the treaty, and it is on the table of the European Council, but they are afraid to deal with it. But at a certain point, we have to obviously arrive to this stage when we are talking about that, maybe in a form of a convention. And yes, we have proposals. The Hungarians have proposals. They have proposals. We can send it to you. It is the brochure on the Conference of the Future of the European Union. So just back to the roots, back to where we were. And you cannot just govern forever against the member states and against the citizens, because this is what we are saying now. The sovereignist forces are emerging, patriots in the European Parliament. So I think this is the way forward.
Thank you very much, Bogi. If I may summarize it very briefly, in every field of life for the success, work is needed, and I believe that the end game for each and any of us is to make Europe great again. But for that, the old motto saying, united in diversity, should come to our mind, and the emphasis should not be all the time be put on the united, but on the diversity aspect of this old motto. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Boglárka Bója, Filip Ziegert, Jerzy Kwasniewski, Ana Miguel de Santos, and Radomir Talcott. Thank you very much.